Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Automating Caffeine Delivery with a Teams CoffeeBot. Can I get a quick show of hands from people in the room? Who's here for Microsoft Teams? About half of you. Who's here for automation and artificial intelligence? Maybe the other half, which means that anyone who didn't put their hand up is here for coffee, I assume. There's coffee outside if you need to go and get it before you start the session. My name is Ben Elias, and I work for a small change management consultancy, and we work in the technology adoption space. And fortunately or unfortunately, I can code. So in my company, I'm the only one who can code, so I get lumped with special projects from time to time. So all the apps and the bots and the other little things that we have to do for our customers, that's my domain. And this is the story of one of those projects. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, so not an employee of Microsoft, but I know a bit about the collaboration technology in Office. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm from Australia. And Australia is known for four things. I've come all this way, so I have to tell you this. The first is that we are known for our cute animals. Koalas actually have really spiky hair and razor-sharp claws, so don't go anywhere near them. But at the same time, they look really cute when they're cuddling in a tree. We have a rock that's dead smack bang in the middle of Australia. Hard to get to, really hot during the day, really cold at night, changes colour at sunrise. The tourists go mad for it. And thirdly, we have 16,000 miles of coastline, so we're known for our beaches. I can't surf personally, but I will take the credit for it. The other thing we're known for is being the centre of the world for hipster coffee culture. So unless you're a barista with a lot of tattoos, you will not get any business. And if you're male, you will also need some kind of beard and probably some sort of ponytail as well to be taken seriously in your coffee caper. And just to illustrate the point, I used to work in an office and we had this massive espresso machine in the kitchen. You know, the type where you actually have to grind the beans and do all the hard work yourself. No one used it. Everyone would go out for their coffee. So in the mornings, if someone wanted to go for a coffee run, then they would stand up and ask, who wants me to get them a coffee? And rather than getting an answer to that question, you would get a question back at you, which is, where are you going? Because if the establishment that you were going to wasn't acceptable to the person who wanted the coffee, then they would politely decline your invitation and get their coffee later themselves. That's the level of coffee snobbery that we have come to in Australia. So as an Australian, I think I'm well qualified to talk about this CoffeeBot topic. What we're going to talk about today, as I'm going through this story, getting beyond function calls and API interactions and the minutiae like that, how do you discover someone's needs, and what design decisions do you have to make for a truly awesome user experience? So that's discovering their intent. The second thing, as we're going through, people realize that they're speaking to a bot. So people interact differently with humans compared to technology. And in a world that's increasingly where technology is wanting to be more human-like, what does that look like? And do we actually want to go there? And lastly, more often than not, we're looking for technology that improves business value. So all your crazy systems, enterprise systems that you have around work, it's doing your accounting better, it's doing your payroll better, it's doing something to make your company function better. So what are these bots for? These silly little apps and bots and things like that. And the answer is that the adoption warm-up is the way you get to being match fit with technology during the main game. So use these as a way to improve people's use of technology so that when they actually have to use it later on, they actually know what they're doing. So I'm going to run through roughly the concept of what I was asked to do. So you have your team, someone from within that team goes out and gets drinks. That's really it in a nutshell. So select a random volunteer. I'll say random in brackets, we'll get to that in a minute. That could be anyone in your team, anyone you select. Capture in some way people's drink preferences, because the person who's the volunteer is not a mind reader, so they might want to know what you actually want to drink. And then show that volunteer a list of orders, presumably to take around with them as they go and order coffee or other beverages and delivered to your desk or cubicle at work. So, who here has had an overly onerous requirement specification thrust on them before? A lot of testing, document this thick for something that you don't think does very much. A couple of hands in the room. This is not one of those times. So this is literally what I got in Teams, which is pretty meta, as the requirement specification for this thing. So we need it to get the context of the team, so who's in the team, fetch their details, post in a channel with an app mention, and send out an adaptive card that takes input from the users. So if we think back to what this actually needs to do, pretty good in terms of trying to describe that in a message. But there's also, reading a bit deeper into this, it illustrates just how implicit some of the assumptions we make about all this stuff is. So how might we discover intent? So I've been asked to make a bot as against a form, as against a web page, as against emailing around a spreadsheet, as against passing around a sheet of paper around the office. So there's all different ways you could do this. The question is, well, why are we doing this with a bot? And secondly, we'll get into it a bit later, but the input I've been asked to use is an adaptive card. So for anyone, there was actually a session in here a little while ago about adaptive cards, so not to take anything away from their wonderful work, but adaptive cards may or may not be the way that you would want to do this. However, as a spec, it's probably enough to go with, particularly for these sort of, I'll call them trivial apps, but you don't need a huge set of rules and you kind of work your way through all the issues. So what are we going to use? Office, the developer, Microsoft Office and the developer community publishes a bunch of examples on GitHub. So the example that I actually took was a Teams sample app and bot in C#, and basically adapted that for my own needs. So it had all the stuff, the sort of boilerplate coding that you need to start off, and you can go from there. Microsoft Bot Framework, so that's the library that we're going to use to interact with this thing. Azure App Service, so that's what we're going to run it on. Again, if you're running Visual Studio, easy to publish from that straight away. And then Teams App Studio, which is actually a bot within Teams, again, pretty meta, which is used to configure the way that you piece all the parts together, let's say. So how do you connect the bot framework with the app service into Teams, which actually it doesn't need to be running in Azure, it doesn't need to be running anywhere in Microsoft. You can run a bot from any server and on your desktop and things like that as well. But obviously most people choose to put it in the cloud because it's easier. The first thing we have to do is select a volunteer within the team. And I would like to know, are there any people, preferably near a corridor, who work together? Anyone sitting next to someone who works with them? Yeah? Okay, you'll get a cup at the end, this gentleman here, for your trouble. Okay. So, what is your name?
Ricky.
And your friend?
Blake.
Okay, so we've got Ricky and Blake. Ricky is going to pretend to be my bot for this little demonstration. Okay, so the aim is I work with Blake, and Ricky's the bot. and I want to get a coffee. So, Ricky, I want a coffee. Who's going to get me a coffee? Excellent answer.
Maybe.
Sorry, he did say Blake. He didn't have the microphone. Maybe pass the mic back. Okay, so that's great. Blake goes and gets us a coffee. Fast forward to tomorrow, and Ricky, I'd like to get a coffee. Who's going to get me a coffee?
You.
Oh, wrong answer. Right, so basically, you really only know about, thank you very much for your help. You really only know about two people in the team at that point. So the idea of random is a little bit odd. And you can actually have a situation where, quite naturally, you can select the same person twice in a row, even though it is random. And that person might feel a bit disenfranchised about the fact that they have been asked 2 days in a row to go and get their team coffee. So we want to do something about this randomness. It doesn't make sense to have it completely random, even though that's what we said. We wanted a random volunteer, but how random is random? And it's a bit of an extreme case, but what it really comes down to is fairness. So the assumption also is that perhaps the person is paying for the coffees. So actually, I care whether I'm selected 2 days in a row. And it will be unfair to have that person going all the time. So here's 3 different options. If you imagine like a lottery where they pick the balls out of a hat or something, with replacement means when I've picked you, tomorrow you're fair game as well. So you could be conceivably picked tomorrow as well. Not quite random is the sort of middle ground, which is I might have picked you recently in the past, say the last time, and therefore I'm not allowed to pick you again, just because I've decided that that's what the rules of the game are. And then on the other side, without replacement is basically you have to exhaust your entire team before anyone gets picked again. So all you're doing is making a random order of things as against randomly picking a member of the team. So it's completely exhaustive. Once someone goes through a round of coffee, then they're out until everyone has been through the whole time. So we've settled on probably the middle one. So this is the thing that we implemented, which was deemed to be fair enough and deemed to not cause too much annoyance. So if you were chosen in the most recent coffee trip, then you're automatically disqualified from getting chosen again for the next one. So I've also had the suggestion that we incorporate salary data to make it even more fair. So it's inversely proportional to the amount of money that you earn. You could go all different ways in this. It's an ethical dilemma. So this is how you kind of think about the randomness. And if we need to remember who gets a coffee, we'll need a database. So the example from the Microsoft C# Teams app doesn't actually have a database attached to it because it's just a bot. So we will use a globally distributed, massively scalable, multi-model, less than 10 millisecond latency, 99th percentile service. So we're going to use Cosmos DB for storing the thing that it was clearly designed to do, which is a list of people who've taken coffee orders. So not a very big, taxing use of that technology, but we have to implement that somehow. So on the right, we have the data structure, which basically just stores an ID of the person who last took the coffee run. And then the random thing is actually slightly harder than it looks. So there is actually a case where there's no people in the team. So it's a little bit of a quirk of Teams when you do some development with it, but guests are actually really hard to understand as an identity in Teams. So you usually go with people's email addresses or some sort of other identifier. What you get out of Teams in terms of the information about a guest is very limited because they're a guest. They're not a real account in your organization. So if a team just consists of mostly guests, you may not actually have real users in the team. It's also possible that there's no valid users in the team anyway. So the last person who got you a coffee is excluded, there's no one else. You might have to pick them again. And so this is the way of, it was a bit of iteration to find out this sort of guest thing, because that was a bit of trial and error while people weren't showing up. But this is the sort of coding algorithm to get you this random kind of thing. So it's not completely random, it's not completely exhaustive, but that's the sort of place. And what we want to really understand from a user perspective is how random is this? So if I tell you it's choosing a random person from the team, people don't expect it to choose the same person over and over again. Like we saw in our example before, I would accuse you of bias if you chose the person, if a human chose the same person over and over again. Okay, so this is what the setup looks like. All right, so anyone in the team can @mention the CoffeeBot to start, and the command is runner. So this is in a channel because everyone needs to see this interaction. And what the CoffeeBot then does is it replies, and it says that today's volunteer, runner, whatever you'd like to call him, is Nesta. So we get little notifications that the CoffeeBot has replied to my message. We also, if you can see on the left in the corner, there's a little chat notification. So the CoffeeBot has actually messaged this person privately, Megan, to let them know something, as well as publicly replying in the channel. So just thinking about the things that we talked about at the beginning, discovering intent. So when you type @CoffeeBot, the only thing you can do is runner. It actually prompts you to do that thing. So it's pretty clear what your intention would have to be if you were @mentioning the CoffeeBot. In fact, it would actually be nice if Teams was more accepting of people not following those rules to the letter. So actually what happens some of the time is that someone types runner in the channel without mentioning the CoffeeBot, expecting somehow magically that the CoffeeBot would know that the message was meant for them. So it's that sort of little behavior where you want it to be a little bit more open to mistakes and things like that. The second thing is I'm talking to a bot. So Teams prompts you for the allowable actions that you have. When you mention the CoffeeBot, the little runner thing came up. That has all the permissible actions that you can do. Here we only have one. That doesn't obviously happen for a human. So if I was to mention a colleague of mine, then it wouldn't come up with some actions that I could do with them or to them. And having one action sets the bar really low. So this is a dumb bot that's not smart, and actually that's a good thing, because people don't expect my bot to do a whole bunch of stuff at that point. They just know that it's for ordering coffee. So this is what happens next, which is the bot gives you a personalized message to each person in the team. So on the left we have Megan, and she is given a message. There's about to be a coffee run in your team. The orders will close in 10 minutes. So basically, as a design decision, we've decided that people have 10 minutes to use it or lose it. In terms of, if you get your order in, I'm not waiting all day for you to come up with your coffee order. I'm going in 10 minutes' time. Fair? Okay. And there's the instruction, type order to place your order. So that happens in both Megan and Nesta's. Nesta's is slightly different. Because he's being picked as the coffee runner, it tells him in a private message, as well as the notification in the channel itself. So the channel will @mention Nesta, so he'll get a notification, but again, it's nice to just have some context here that he's going to be interacting with this bot from now on in the private one-to-one chat conversation. So it says type order, as in write order, to get around a switching issue. So otherwise, if they just started typing, then we have no context. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail now. So when we had a team scope, so we had a conversation in the channel, someone said CoffeeBot runner, the response came from the CoffeeBot, it named the volunteer, and that was all good. It happened in the team channel. It was all public and visible. What we now need to do is what's called proactive messaging. So we need to get the bot to actually ask or send a message to each person in the team. So you can imagine this as not only one proactive message going left to right, but there's a whole bunch of proactive messages going on. So the trigger for this to happen is @CoffeeBot runner. This whole process is being triggered by @CoffeeBot runner. So they've got a team scope and then multiple personal scopes happening from then on. What the architecture unfortunately constrains us here, how the architecture constrains us, is that's the end of the conversation. So the conversation started off as a team scope. The bot has the context for how that was created. And by the time it gets to the personal scope, it has the context and the history of a path from the team scope to the personal scope. Now, when the person then replies in the personal scope, that conversation has effectively ended. The conversation CoffeeBot runner has effectively ended. So they are starting up a new conversation with the bot. Even though you might not realize it, and even though it looks really similar to I'm replying to something, it's not actually part of the same context because the context belongs back in that team scope. So proactive messaging is good, but we need some way of getting context back again when we start talking to each user in that personal one-to-one chat. So the way of doing that is to tell them to order a coffee, and that's a command which starts up a new conversation. So you then have context of what my intent is at that point in time. Otherwise, you just start listening for random coffee orders in a one-to-one messaging conversation, which may or may not be what someone actually wanted to do because there's no context there. So a little bit hard to explain and very nuanced, but it's a difficult problem to get around. So it's basically a new conversation. You have to start up a new conversation when you finish that one message into the personal scope. And for the people who want to go into the slide deck perhaps later on, but walking through the code, what we've done here is we've actually queued a bunch of asynchronous tasks up. So what we've done is we've got the @mention and then the runner, and then we've got all the people in the team, and then queue up for all the 20 people in the team. We want to run an asynchronous task to send them each a message. And then we queue all those messages up, and then we execute them all, and when it's done, then what we do at this point is actually put in a blank order. So this is the way you know that a coffee run has started for you in the individual context, because at the time of sending you a message, I gave you a blank order in somewhere in the system. So that's a sort of a double check that you're doing things correctly. It's horribly asynchronous waiting on the right-hand side. So we need to wait for the team information, which is sort of the third or fourth line down, and then you have to send 2 messages, again, asynchronous tasks. It's not great, but it's the only way of doing this. So we've asked them to create an order as in type an order command. So when we mention the bot in the one-to-one conversation, one of the things that will come up, prompt automatically, is order. And even though people don't realize what they're doing, they're starting a new conversation with us. So we can search, reverse search, does that user have an order in the system somewhere? And that's how we find our context again, even though we lost it. So we talked about adaptive cards at the beginning, and this is what it may look like. So I'll just on this little demonstration. So we type order in an individual context, and the bot will eventually come back and prompt us with a bunch of coffees, and we can go and select, it shows us the team, the channel, the time, we select a coffee, submit, and that puts in our order. So it gets really awkward. So here we've got 4 coffees, and it's a lot of hassle for something which is really just, I really want to ask one question, and I'm only expecting one answer. I'm not expecting to have a whole big dialogue about this, no pun intended. It's a really clumsy way of discovering this type of intent. So one thing just to notice, just to confuse everyone who's using Teams, again, you don't have to mention the bot in the one-to-one conversation because obviously you're having the conversation with the bot. So that means that sometimes in the channel conversation, the behavior is reinforced, so that this is when they do the random runner phrases and then don't get anything to happen. So they complain that the bot doesn't work when they type runner, but actually it's a problem with the design of the system, not with the design of the bot. Sorry, we ran that video. What we want to do is we want to capture a real coffee order. And there's lots of different types of coffee. So I actually went into Starbucks on the weekend and looked at their menu. It's deceptively simple because they present their menu in steps. So you actually have probably hundreds of coffees that you could order in Starbucks, but the menu's quite simple because you know that you want a large and it has to have vanilla syrup and it has to have whatever else in it. So you've got all these options you can add in, and they're probably all mutually exclusive, but the menu's actually quite simple. So realistically, when you go into a cafe or coffee shop, there's a bunch of different coffees you can order, and the barista should be able to produce all of them for you. So this adaptive card thing really doesn't work so well when we're trying to deal with a lot of possible inputs. The UI just kind of blows out a little bit. So if you're trying to order a real coffee, what we need to do is add some sort of language capture process. So I've typed order. What do I want? I want a skim flat white. Thank you for ordering a skim flat white. Now you can go and check the orders if you want to do that. Now, if you notice really carefully, we could have stopped there, because the thing I typed after what would you like to order is probably enough detail for the person who's relaying my order to the coffee shop later on. Just report that full sentence back to the volunteer. But that's no fun. So it'd be really nice if I could give them a list of coffees rather than a list of responses. The please and the thank you, all the little words that you insert around the order, strip them out. And for that, we need some sort of language processing and artificial intelligence. So before we go into Luas specifically, and how Luas might deal with the coffee, coffees according to Luas. So it's just to recap on what the model and the concepts look like. We have utterances, so they're sentences, phrases, things you might tell the computer, something you say. An intent is an action that you want to do. So my intent might be to order a coffee or buy an airline ticket or do something else. And then an entity. So where am I going with that airline ticket? What are the details around the intent that I'm trying to convey? And the default is I'm not trying to do anything. So the none intent is a valid outcome. So now that we understand these three concepts, we can play my favorite AI game, which is taxonomy bingo, which is I'll have a strong almond decaf cappuccino, thanks. So you can go through and all these different boxes and you can have your little bingo card and what do people order. Coffee taxonomy is surprisingly hierarchical. So you have basically some sort of caffeine preparation, there's a milk type involved, there may be a plant based in the milk type as well. You have a strength, you have a heat, you have a length in terms of how much water you end up adding to it. This is easily translated into computer stuff because we love taxonomy. And the temptation is to do this because we need to understand how a barista would actually make your order. So if you ask them for a strong almond decaf cappuccino, they would know that they would need to get the almond milk out and 2 shots of coffee, and so it goes on. But do we really want to go down that path? So it feels like two extremes. At one end, we've got this copy and paste your order. And at the other end, we've got this really detailed understanding of what the coffee order is, like some sort of really semantic understanding of what the coffee is. So we've got decisions to make about how we use artificial intelligence in this system design. So to just show you what the Luas model looks like, and it's not very interactive, so I've just done screenshots here. But we've really only got one intent, and that's to order a coffee. So again, the bot's quite simple, but then again, the Luas model is also quite simple as well. We've also got something called no change. So again, the sort of nitty-gritty of the bot design is that if you order a coffee, you have to be able to update that coffee or cancel that coffee, you know, all the usual things you can do with data objects. And then Luas also provides you with some utility classes as well. So utility cancel, confirm, they basically do what they say on the tin. So rather than you having to train up someone else or another model to do cancelling, then they've done it for you. You just import their model and that's great. So that's the intents. Then attempt one was to do this, basically that coffee taxonomy. So if you can see, sorry, from the back of the room, but what we've done is we've taken the coffee and the top line is a coffee is a combination of a milk type and a preparation. So here we have a weak chai latte. It's recognised milk type as weak, but anyway. Strong almond cap, which is strength, milk type, and preparation. Again, so we've sort of tried to over-engineer this a little bit. And this was done last year. And then Luas decided that the hierarchical thing wasn't a very good idea anyway, so they deprecated the feature. So even though they originally had this concept where you could take a semantic set of words and break them down into different subsets and things like that, they effectively decided that that wasn't very good. And that's perfectly okay with me. In my testing of a very small sample size, Luas recognising a whole range of drinks, not just coffees, but other drinks as well, was just as good as me trying to break it down into, chunking it down into every type of drink you could possibly have, then coffees, then teas, and then soft drinks and things like that. So it didn't perform any better by trying to do all that work to create the semantic map. So that's good. So they didn't allow you to do that anymore. So the entities we now have are a drink, and that's basically it. Why overcomplicate it? Why overcomplicate this? The other thing is we're ordering this coffee. So if we think about big picture system design, all we need to do is order the coffee. We do not actually need to understand how to make the coffee. That's the barista's job. And it's actually quite accurate, even with one drink entity. not splitting them up. It's really easy to create these Luas models. So if I did it, anyone can. And the other thing with Luas, it's a big, or artificial intelligence is a big, massive, sort of complicated to navigate your way through in the Microsoft world. This just deals with language, so purely sentences and phrases and things like that. So if you use the adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words, that means that trying to recognize a sentence is 1,000 times easier than trying to recognize a picture. So obviously from trying to put together a model as well, that should be it. The last thing we want to do is show the team's coffee orders. So first thing, please do what you're told. So you have been asked to order a coffee, and what this person does is they show the orders anyway without ordering a coffee. So you have to deal with that in some way. All of these in the bot framework, context switching basically. But what the person did wasn't what you asked them to do. You have to handle that in some way. Because we're not deeply involved in an ordering conversation yet with the person, we can just do what they ask and move on. So it's just the annoyance of having to deal with that. Oops, sorry. Okay, during the order. So during the order, we can check the order, and this will show us that we've got one order for the team. There's still 4 minutes to go, and Nesta's the one who's presumably going to get me a coffee. So we can also finalize this run early. So we've decided, for example, that everyone's already ordered, so why would I leave it open another 4 minutes? I should just go and get the coffees now. Why wait until 10 minutes is up? So there's an option to close it early. Again, that's a design decision. So should we close it early? Do I give those 4 minutes to people so that they can go and amend their order or cancel it or do something because they think they've got 10 minutes? That kind of thing. So again, really trivial, but just think about the user experience of someone who's been given 10 minutes to do something and they've done it ahead of time. Should they be rewarded in some way for doing that? So coming early. And then, so 4 minutes later, perhaps, we can do the show orders again. And it will come back, and now Megan has added her order to the list. And can we finalize it? Yes, we can. Thank you. And it's closed off. Here are the orders. So we've tried to give a one-to-one message. It could be an adaptive card if you wanted to structure the formatting in a better way. But here's the orders. Here's what everyone has ordered. Order status is complete, and the sponsor /volunteer/random is Nesta. So he's the one who's going to go and get it. So everyone can see these orders. They're public. Again, you can come up with examples perhaps where you wouldn't want people to see aggregated responses. But in this case, it seems to be fine. You're going to watch them drinking their coffee anyway, perhaps, as they get it. So talking about discovering intent, the secret to happiness is low expectations. So start off with a bot that's really dumb and people aren't going to expect you to do very much. The open-ended choices are much better suited to Luas. So where we have a coffee, there's this amorphous concept. We don't want a drop-down box. We don't want checkboxes. We want, ideally, to have some sort of natural language. And then limit the Luas taxonomy where possible. So it's much easier to order a coffee than it is to make it. That's why all of us go to the baristas to get it done professionally. Validate intent. So back to this point of typing runner into a random context and not realizing what it was. The other thing that can happen is someone types @mentioned CoffeeBot runner a lot of times. So they could do it, there's nothing that's stopping them doing it every hour. Do they really want to do that every hour? Is it appropriate that they do that every hour? There's actually a mechanism to limit it to once a day without deliberately saying that you want to override that. So basically, if you have a coffee order in your team and then later in the afternoon, someone else says, actually, I want a coffee now as well, it will say, do you really want to do this? You've already had a coffee today. And if you say yes, it will then trigger off the whole system. But it's that extra step of basically confirming intent, validating the intent that you really wanted to do this. So never ever, as sort of kind advice to people who create bots, never ever get it to do something without checking first. Because inevitably, I mistyped something or I mistyped a number and I get 300 more than I thought or something like that. It's that sort of, do you get validation for what you actually input? And it's okay to switch contexts. So we have this system where there's some communication with the entire channel, there's some communication as a one-to-one private message, but keeping track is tricky, not only from a technical perspective, but also from the point of view of people's headspace, right? You've had a message over here, there's a conversation going on in the channel about who's ordering the coffee, but then off to the side I have a separate conversation about what I want. It's not ideal, but it's probably appropriate to try and do that in this regard. The second thing is that I asked you to think about before as we go through is this I'm speaking to a bot concept. And I'd like to describe to you a concept in animation called the Uncanny Valley. So if we animate a character, it's illustrated, then it's fine. It doesn't matter how badly we draw it, it's not going to be terrible. But as the drawing gets better, it becomes more likable. It becomes more, we think of it as more human, you can be friendly to it, you can provide more personality with a better drawn avatar, if you like. And at the other end of the scale, which is photorealistic, real human, it's even better. So we interact with humans more favourably than we do with hand-drawn images, for example. And you would think that the graph goes kind of up, generally up. But actually it goes like this. And the section at the bottom is called the Uncanny Valley. And what that's basically saying is up to a point, it gets better and better and better. But then when it's not quite a human, and we know it's not quite a human, it's actually worse. So that's when you get into this trough. There's some great examples in animated film where they've tried really hard to make human characters, and they got quite close, but actually it looks really scary. So people don't like them. I haven't put them up here, but you can search the internet for those examples if you want to find some. And what I'm suggesting is that we have the same thing happen to bots. So we have this thing where I know it's a bot, it's really dumb, it only has 3 things I can say to it, it's utilitarian, it's okay. Then I try and make it a bit smarter. I generally like dealing with things that are smarter and generally have responses to my concerns as being interactive as against just having to participate in their conversation on their terms. But at some point we're going to face this same problem, which is I don't want to make it too human-like because I'm going to miss the mark and end up at the bottom. So perhaps we're not there yet, but just something to keep in mind that actually when you create these things, the aim may not be to be completely human. What I'm asking you to do here is really embrace your project being imperfect, whatever you make. Embrace the concept in the CoffeeBot of not quite random selections. So embrace in some way choices, commands, drop-downs, things that get you back in that space of firmly, it's not a human. and I'm clearly describing this thing as not a human equivalent. So it's okay not to be human and not to be super intelligent and things like that. It actually works out better sometimes. Okay, if there's one thing that computers like more than adding up, it's logging stuff. And for our dear users, Luas logs everything they say. So that's to learn from their mistakes, so you can classify it better, that kind of thing. But there's always one comedian when you create these sort of things. And at the bottom here, I'm going to order 20-ounce 4-shot third decaf, non-fat, whatever, 4 sweetened lows and extra whipped cream. Apparently that's a coffee. Interestingly, it recognised it as a chocolate cappuccino. And it's good that it recognised something, but it's probably not great that it recognised it in this way. So this is an actual example of someone who's gone in and decided that this is the coffee they were going to order just to see if it works. Right? And as the person who created this, I'm going to have to deal with these people. I can't tell them to go away. They're going to be in my system. I'm just going to have to suck it up and somehow, go along with it. But it illustrates this sort of universal truth when it comes to dealing with humans and technology, which is knowing that there's a computer on the other side means that someone's going to try and trick it or just test its limits. And as the designer of the system, I have to expect this, and I have to try and, to the best of my ability, at least fail gracefully when it comes to that stuff. The other thing to think about, just to illustrate how absurd this is if you went into a cafe and ordered this in front of a real human, they would probably ask you to leave. Right? They would not deliver that beverage. So people treat other humans and people treat technology very differently, and we kind of have to plan for that. The third thing we want to think about is Botsford adoption. So we typically call these things line of business apps, LOB for some reason. I don't know why you need to make an acronym out of it necessarily, but they are business focused in the sense that it's not an IT system, it's for end users, that kind of thing. But think about what the coffee process actually, or the coffee ordering process actually embodies. So it's existing. People know how to caffeinate themselves today already. You don't have to create a new behaviour for this. It's frequent. It's something that people do every day, if not more. So people have experience of doing this fairly regularly. They're practiced at it. It's simple in the sense that I do not need a manual to understand how to go and order a coffee. Like, it's sort of self-evident what I need to do. I need to go out of the building, I need to find something that has cafe written on the side of the building, go in and approach the counter, order a coffee, etc. So there's no technical know-how to doing this. And the last thing is independent. So if you think about a typical enterprise scenario, you have a bunch of interconnected systems that, the logistics does one thing and that connects to some sort of payment system and that connects to payroll, and like all these things have to talk to each other, otherwise the system comes to a grinding halt. This is just a small, lightweight, independent coffee ordering system. It does not have to sync with anything else in your company necessarily. So that's really good from an adoption perspective. If you can find those processes which exist at work, whether or not they exist for work, but they exist at work, that's really great to find. So what we're doing here is helping people discover features. So if we think about what we've done through the examples that I've just shown you today, I've mentioned something. I've discovered where private messages exist. I have discovered notifications, where my notifications come if I get a new message or I get mentioned. So all those sort of things are really that baseline level of understanding the product. So once you have understood all these notifications and mentions and things like that, messages where they are, you can now do that for a real business use later on. You've been conditioned to where those things live and are just through this really lightweight bot process. And it's really different to scaling out a business process. So if you think about the use cases that people talk about for bots these days, it's like I want an HR bot that does question and answer about how much annual leave I have. It syncs with the leave system. All I'm trying to do here is actually outsource a call center because it's cheaper to do this with a bot than it is have people on the phone. That's fine, makes your business run more efficiently. But bots for adoption is we want people to use this product. Even if it's for a so-called silly use, we want them to be able to use it so that when they need to use it for business, then that will come later and they can do that effectively. So, discovering intent, structure when you need it. We had a very structured runner command in the opening. It limited your choice. The bot only does one thing, and it sets that expectation very low up front. Speaking to a bot, people interact really differently with bots versus real people, so that and have different expectations. So the expectation being the randomness, and then you get these comedians coming along. And then the uncanny valley where human technology doesn't morph into bot-like behavior and vice versa. It actually follows a slightly different path. So what kind of bots would actually encourage adoption rather than just replacing your existing systems? So again, it's really tempting to try and just replace the things that you have with sort of friendlier versions of them. So how do you interact with a big clunky HR system? You make it nice and friendly as a bot front end, but actually you might want to do bots for adoption as well. We have some time for questions. So there's a microphone at the front. If you would like to come up, the first two questions also get a lovely reusable coffee cup, like that. So yeah, feel free. Sorry, there will be some slides after the questions, so we've got them to go as well.
How did you manage to store the run?
Sorry?
How did you manage to store the run? What's the storage engine behind the bot? Because you have to store all the orders and that a run is active at a certain point in time. Which storage technology did you use to store all these?
Yeah, so that's the Cosmos DB storage engine. So again, massive overkill for what we're trying to do, but that's the thing that Azure gives you in terms of probably the easiest integration with a C#.NET framework. So yeah. Yeah, come up.
So my question is actually about the process itself. So my team has like similar things, coffee runs, but we just have people send their Starbucks orders. So your bot can just assign somebody and collect a few names and then collect from the store, so you don't have to handle the order process. So why you have to build this, not leverage third-party apps?
Yeah, so I guess this was actually a customer request of our consultancy, first of all. So there was actually a real customer need to do that. Whether or not wait for the slides that I'm about to show you afterwards in terms of perhaps answering that question as well. But it is a different experience. So again, for whatever reason, culturally or otherwise, when I told you that story about people saying, where are you going for a coffee? I don't live in a world that it doesn't matter which Starbucks you go to, it's going to be the same one. You're going to end up with the same product when you get back to the office. So because people go to all these different cafes and have their preferences and all that sort of stuff, that's the cultural aspect you're designing into this system as against perhaps trying to bypass the middleman and sort of send the order straight to Starbucks, for example.
So does this have the location check, like say which shop are you going to?
No, but arguably I should have put that in there if I was concerned about.
And then pull out the menu of that coffee shop so they can just order off the menu?
Yeah, well, presumably you can get whatever coffee you want out of the coffee shop. So yeah, I guess we typically frequent cafes without menus, if that makes sense. You make up the menu for them. So my favorite coffee is not actually on a menu, but the barista understands what they need to do to get it. Thank you.
Yeah, how would you deal with the loss of context where you have multiple, runs going at the same time on different channels, and you could have the same people in multiple teams?
Yeah.
How would you deal with the loss of context there?
So at the moment, that doesn't deal with it. Okay, I'm just going to go to the slides where this one. So to answer your question, I think I might have actually taken it off, but one of the things that does become a problem is that you're a member of multiple teams and they all had a coffee run and you're now doing the next run even though you just had a coffee and stuff like that. So you can presumably design some sort of safeguards against overlapping teams, but again, in the customer that we designed this for, it just wasn't required. But at the same time, it's a much bigger question because you have questions of geography, physical proximity, all that sort of stuff to deal with.
I'm just thinking it'd be a common problem for other types of applications.
Yeah.
I guess you could give them a GUID or something that they get put in there. And this is the coffee order that I want to participate in. If there's multiple coffee orders open or something, but that loss of context I could see being an issue with the whole designing bots.
Definitely, if you were to try and scale this across a really large organization, it's something that you'd have to deal with in some way. Just to go through these quickly, where you could extend this, so configuration, you could make this not just 10 minutes, you could make it an hour, something like that. Make it all Luas, so understand everything. Predictive intelligence, I order the same coffee all the time. Maybe it knows when I want a coffee. Automate the ordering at the cafe, as the lady suggested. Make the coffee, so for anyone with Raspberry Pi skills and IoT desires, you can do that. And then other contexts. So as perhaps this gentleman was alluding to, this is not just about the coffee. You can do other stuff with this as well. So we have the possibility of creating some really awesome things with different parts of the Microsoft ecosystem coming together. And I've just chosen probably 3 things here, and you made this CoffeeBot thing. Microsoft has a heap of ready-made tools that you can combine together to make something extraordinary. And it really doesn't take very much. So there's good documentation out there, there's passionate people, there's open source projects or samples from Microsoft more often than not. And the one thing I'm going to ask you today is not to get stuck building boring stuff. So CoffeeBot, it's fun. It was fun to build. Don't just do what you're asked in terms of the boring enterprise systems that you create. It will be published on GitHub, the CoffeeBot thing, and Twitter. Collaborator is my handle on Twitter. So reach out if you've got any questions, and if you're ever in Sydney and need to know where to get a coffee, get in touch. The last thing, please take out your phones right now and open up the event app, fill out the session evaluation. As speakers, we live and die by the feedback, so it will be really appreciated if you did it. I know I have missed doing some session evaluations in the past, so please don't do that. And thank you very much.